Hello, everybody. My name's Gene Hayworth. I'm the publisher and editor-in-chief at Owl Canyon Press, and I'd like to welcome you to our first virtual book release party. At the end of the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and post comments in the chat, and I will share them with today's speakers. I'd also like you to know that we will be recording today's session for later viewing. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Jampol, author of The Brothers Silver. Mark wrote Music from Words, published by Bell Day Books in 2007, and Cubist States of Mind, Not the Cruelest Month, published by Poets Haven Press in 2017. His poems and short stories have appeared in many journals and anthologies. A former television news reporter and public relations executive, Mark has written about 1,800 freelance articles for a wide range of magazines, newspapers, and scholarly journals. The Brothers Silver is his first novel. Please join me in welcoming Mark Jampol.
Great. Wonderful. You're all muted, so I can't hear the applause. So that's probably good because I tend to get fat-headed anyhow. To quote Ian Hunter at the very end of Mott the Hoople's version of All the Young Dudes, I've been waiting to do this for years. And here it is finally. I've published my first novel, a book I've been writing off and on for a few decades. So let me start by giving everyone here assurances that it will take only a year or two more before my second novel, tentatively titled Four Elements, is finished. Whether that's a promise or a threat, I'll leave you readers to decide. So before I tell you a little bit about the Brothers Silver and read a few short excerpts, I want to thank a few people. First, thanks to everyone who was on the Zoom call for celebrating with me the publication of the Brothers Silver. If this event was in person, I would zoom around the room and thank everyone personally, but I can't do that. Thanks, of course, go to Gene Hayward and his team at Owl Canyon Press for taking a chance on my novel. And I also want to thank Jennifer Johnson, Gary Levine, Ariel Stein, Claire McKinney, Sonia Dalton, and everyone else who's helping me to market the Brothers Silver. Really does take a village. And I want to give a special call out to 4 people who reviewed and critiqued various iterations of the novel, including the earlier versions, which had some writing that was just awful. So thanks to Sonia Boyd-Dayan, Juliet Neidish-Franco, William Torfey, and Michael Hershenson. Finally, I would like to thank my life partner, Kathy, and my son and daughter-in-law, Ezra and Sarah, for their emotional support through the long years of writing my first novel. Now to the Brothers Silver. The novel is about what happens to survivors of childhood trauma. It traces 2 brothers, Jules and Leon Silver, as they grow up in a home haunted by mental illness, drug abuse, and domestic violence. The book then follows the boys as they make their unanchored way through the last decades of the 20th century. What makes the novel distinctive, I think, is that the 12 chapters are written in 10 different voices, each of which has its own language and style, and each of which knows only his or her part of the total story. 2 of the chapters are even written in irregular rhymes. I'm going to read 3 short sections. The first section is from the first chapter, which is narrated by the older brother Jules as a preteen. One of his escapes from what is a truly hellish home life is to ride his bicycle down a very steep and rocky hill overlooking the Grand Central Parkway in the easternmost part of Queens, called Suicide Hill. And anyone who grew up in eastern Queens will be able to confirm that there really was a Suicide Hill. So this is Jules talking about Suicide Hill. I nudge my bike up Suicide Hill. At the summit runs a barbed wire fence. On this side, descent to trees and garden apartments. The other side, a dark and dizzy plunge to landfill and the Grand Central Parkway. When lots of kids are there, we trudge to the back of the line and skiff down, one guy at a time. We all know about the time two boys tracked too close together. One bike clipped the other, and one of them took a spill and lost control. The rocks ripped the boy's brains apart as he rolled inertly down the hill, stopping stiff and bleeding at a doorsill. On my bike now, rattling handlebars, spinning spokes, feet spread apart, the wind resistance chills my face. I glide sweat-soaked down the hill, past bushes and chokeweeds, cold and tense with the fear and thrill of jolting speed. My bike is shaking over stones and bumps, going ever faster as I advance. Wind is droning at my back. Tires are thumping over clumps of grass. Metal parts are straining, groaning like a grunting antelope as I tack to steeper slope, eyes wide and trained on the bottom. Acceleration fills my heart like freedom, not freedom of speech, not freedom to vote, not freedom of religion, to live where you would, not to read a book nor buy a boat, not to take an action nor to do some good, but freedom to be free, freedom to be here, the freedom of tearing through space and time with verve, the freedom to rumble swiftly down the hill by myself, dash towards the courtyard of apartments at the bottom, and at the final moment swerve to avoid a crash. So now I'm going to read a passage from the second chapter, which is narrated by Ed Silver, the boy's father. Now, Ed, I won't be giving any away secrets, it's pretty obvious when you read it, is a truly despicable guy, a vulgar, brutish narcissist, a misogynist, and a control freak who is also a chronic gambler who especially loves betting on horses. But he's also fairly clever. In this chapter, he's complaining both his children are getting into radical politics. He worries that Jules has risked his scholarship by leading a civil rights demonstration. Besides, there's no chance his side is going to win, and the winners always write history. No one is going to remember this demonstration. Hell, no one is probably going to remember the civil rights or the anti-war movements at the end of the day. And even if they remember them, they'll think it's an aberration because the establishment is going to win and write the story. Take the Old Testament. It tells us how wonderful and pious David was, how wonderful Joseph and Jacob were, but they all won rivalries and therefore got to control the telling of the tale. Think about it. Samuel, the religious leader of the country, and a very bright guy, selected Saul as king. Saul must have had some competence in matters important to the state, military and organizational prowess, or the ability to stir men's hearts to the defense of the 12 tribes. Undoubtedly a thoroughbred himself, David used the army of his country's enemy to take the throne, an entire horde of ringers, which is a hell of a lot worse than shaving points. David then sent his best general on a suicide mission so he could screw the guy's wife. Which of the two seems more legit, Saul or David? History presents David as a young, multi-talented genius, and Saul as a cranky old man. But that's clearly a whitewash, and we know that Ishmael fathered a nation even more fruitful than Isaac's, and thus was just as deserving of Abraham's favor, at least in the abstract. And we know that Esau was a great hunter, a skill greatly prized in early nomadic cultures. He had skills, yet history, written by Jacob's descendants, presents Esau as a brutish compared to the sophisticated, cunning Jacob. There was a lot of sibling rivalry back then that determined the dispensation of flocks, lands, and slaves. Apart from inheritance, how else could a father reward a favorite? Winners and losers. We don't know what really happened in history because the winners sanitize their actions and denigrate the losers. The only thing we can be absolutely sure of is that Joseph really did fuck Potiphar's wife. I know I would have. Yeah, I see that some of you are laughing at least. Okay, so now the last chapter is told by a 21st century Jules, now in his early 60s, taking a trip back in time and remembering his life in his late 20s and early 30s. He recalls one of his African American friends, Vern, an assistant professor of math, who lived in the same San Francisco apartment building as Jules did decades earlier. And this is his memory of an afternoon with Vern. Hanging around Loaded one afternoon, we started perusing an old box of pop and rock 45s I had saved from my teen years. Lots of Motown, Four Tops, The Temptations, Marvin Gaye. Vern pulled out Dee Clark's Raindrops and asked me to play it. I couldn't get enough of that song as a kid, I said, but now I think it's crappy. The bogus thunder in the background, the flabby violins, the sappy lyrics that sound like they're sung with a happy grin, even though his heart is supposed to be broken. Completely fake. Not completely, Vern said. Listen to the last four words just before the fade out. In a blood-quaking instant, Dee captures the dark, God-forsaken history of my people in this land. He wails the pain of centuries, pain of smelling death and feces chained in the hull of a ship sailing west, pain of searing brand on thigh, of hours of cranking up a cotton gin, half dead from withstanding everyday daily whippings, of gawking without protest as your trafficked children roll away from the slave mart in shotgun-guarded carts, of knowing the master sticks it to his sweetheart whenever he wants to, the pain of acting deferential to people who reprimand him for his color, the pain of losing land he plowed for years to legal tricks, the pain of fear of seeming too proud or gabbing too loud, the fear of scaring white women with his looks, the fear of beatings, lynchings, firebombs, the pain of shame of his seat in his shabby, crowded, worse than hillbilly school at the chilly back of the bus, and cold outside the restaurant while they grill his grub, the pain of sniper bullets, rubber hoses, ugly curses, dirt-rubbed face, the pain of whispers that assume a genetic inheritance of thievery, laziness, and competence, the pain of being forced by the record producer to smile all the while he sings of pain, until the fade out of an inane power ballad after 2 minutes of grinning through a sweet conflation of raindrops, it must be raindrops, it feels like raindrops, against the rising obligato of the violins, calling forth a suddenly hoarse and harsh, ear-splitting, fog-cutting cry that forces centuries of the inhumane into 4 short words. It keeps on falling. He says all that in 3 seconds. I hear all that in 3 seconds. Vern was expressing an immensely explosive anger, yet he seemed so self-composed. He never raised his voice, no matter how intense the discussion. Do you ever blow up and try to put your fist through the plasterboard or begin kicking the fence? It happens to me all the time, I asked. Can't afford to. Whether I'm going along to get along or resisting, no matter what I feel within, I have to stay under control or risk making things worse because of the color of my skin. I get to keep my self-respect that way, yes, but self-protection is a much greater reward, especially when the pigs suspect you. Twice, I said, I've told cops to fuck themselves and fan the finger under their noses. They didn't flinch either time, completely deadpan. That's because every inch of you looks like the man, and maybe one day you'll be the man. I suppose you'll be a better man, the current man, but you'll still be the man. So I hope those segments have excited you enough to buy 4 or 5 copies and give them to your friends, and then buy a few more. Okay.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I hope you didn't find that too tedious, guys.
So joining us now to interview Mark is Tom Strelich. Tom was born into a family of professional wrestlers and raised in Bakersfield, California, and his writing career began on Adair while he was a graduate student in botany. His plays include Baffo, Best and Final Offer, which was commissioned by and had its world premiere at South Coast Repertory and its New York premiere at the American Place Theater. Dog Logic, which also had its world premiere at South Coast Repertory and went on to win a Kennedy Center Fund for New American Plays Award for its New York premiere at the APT, and Nelson Psalms, which won the Dramatists Guild CBS New Play Award for its world premiere at the Magic Theater in San Francisco and its New York premiere at the APT. Tom's honors include a National Endowment for the Arts grant for playwrights, the Beverly Hills Theater Guild Playwright Award, and commissions from South Coast Repertory and the Actors Theater of Louisville. He has one screen credit out there for Showtime, and his first novel, Dog Logic, very loosely based on the play, was published in October 2017. Tom, over to you.
Well, I'm going to do my best to keep enticing you to read the book. I have the advantage of having read it. And so what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through the 12 chapters, giving you kind of a setup for each one, and then pose the question to Mark based on what I've talked about. So first chapter is Joel's point of view. So it's the protagonist's point of view and in his voice. And I wanted to pick up the thread from the Suicide Hill thing. So a few pages after that, there's some very funny song parodies, as young boys would make up. Right. Walks through New York, and a bunch of things revealing character insights and of the protagonist. And he returns to the hill. I don't know if it's the same hill as Suicide Hill, but it's maybe down the other side of it or something, toward where the highway is. And he's rolling down the hill, not on a bike, but just himself rolling down. At least I'm pretty sure he's rolling down it. And as he's going down, he's having this kind of really interesting, fascinating stream of consciousness going on. Or it might be a dream. I wasn't sure. But the cool thing is when he gets down to the bottom, it keeps kind of spooling out of him. And it's essentially, when I read it, I thought, wow, it's a core dump. Now, I'm a computer science guy, and core dump is what happens when a computer bombs and it dumps the entire contents of the memory. So it's code, it's data, it's state, things like that. And programmers and systems analysts look at that and use that to kind of diagnose what went wrong. And so what Mark's doing here is basically a literary technique. I call it a character core dump. And he uses it many times, not just for this one character, but kind of consistently throughout. There'll be these spillages out of the brains of people as they're thinking and dreaming and whatever. And it's kind of neat because it's revealing their inner selves, but not in a kind of a rational, logical way, but in a more emotional or organic and in a very poetic way, as you heard from his reading, which leads to the question. So this is now the question for Mark. How much did your poetry background express itself in the prose and the dialogue? So take it away, Mark.
Okay, that's an interesting question. So the poetry, so I've started this novel in this iteration as a poem, the first chapter as a prose poem. And then it just took off from there. I've been a poet for many years, although I have fooled around with some prose. And so language is so important to me. And so I look for ways to use poetry in the narrative. And there are different kinds of poetry structures, one of which you called a core dump. It's sometimes called a list poem, but I don't like calling it that because I think that I try to give it shape so it's going somewhere, not just a list, but there's some dynamism, so it goes somewhere. So the scene that you specifically referenced, Tom, is also a Walpurgisnacht. Wow, why did I do that? Walpurgisnacht is it's kind of takes place in Germanic countries and Scandinavian countries, and it's a night when dedicated to some saint named Walpurga. It's a night when all the witches come out. And so in this case, it's not the witches coming out, but it's the people that Jules has known. And there you see an appearance here of virtually everyone in Jules's life. And they're all around the cauldron of Jules' emotion at this point. So was that any kind of an answer?
Yeah, absolutely. I just was, curious where how that kind of fit in. So that takes me briefly into chapter 2, because you had mentioned with your the father's voice. Chapter 2 right. is the father's voice, and you already mentioned he was a reprehensible character. And when I pick up the thread from the Old Testament reading and confronting the kind of the misogyny and the racism and the assortment of detestable traits in a truly unlikable character, but nevertheless a pivotal and a driving character, because he fueled the boys and the wreckage around them. So the question is, how hard was it to crawl into the skin of that character, and did you need to find some filament of goodness to make him bearable to write at all?
That's interesting. So there are filaments of goodness in all well-written characters. I guess that doesn't apply to Dickens because his characters are flat, but certainly in the 21st century and much of the 20th century. So, the salient trait for this character is narcissism. So I was able to draw on my own narcissism, but beyond that, I had a couple of clients who I used as models because they were very narcissistic and full of themselves. I'm talking about clients when I had a PR agency. So believe it or not, I finished everything having to do with this character pretty much before Trump. Because you could look at Trump as a kind of a model, but he wasn't. So what I did was I looked for models of people that would be like this guy, and unfortunately, in the generation that's called the Great Generation and then the Silent Generation, those two generations, just before the baby boomers, there are a lot of men who have some of these traits. So that's basically what I did. I looked for people. I knew what the character had to be like. I knew the character, like every writer knows all their characters. I just had to do things to make other people know it. And that's always a matter of little brushstrokes, like always using the gambling expressions, which you heard a couple in that one segment. And in the full chapter, there are many more. Just the kind of language. And I wrote the whole thing with a smirk on my face. Because this character would have a smirk on its face all the time, kind of like this, like he knows it, so
Well, I'm just relieved that it wasn't a single person, but it was a composite drawn from several sources, but there was no one except for Trump
I would say
who would who would
that's accurate. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of it came from one person, but there were several people I was able to draw inspiration from in creating this character.
well, speaking of several people, in chapter 3, now the interesting thing, because again, and the people in call can look at the back cover of the book because it talks about the structure of it and using different voices in each chapter. And chapter 3 was interesting because it was all dialogue between the aunt and the uncle.
Right, and aunt and uncle.
And
There are lots of
yeah,
aunts and uncles and
there's a lot of aunts and uncles.
cousins and friends. You know,
Yeah.
there's a whole world of people in here. I'm sorry, Tom,
Yeah,
go ahead.
no, but yeah, this is just like one of the sets of aunts and uncles. There's a whole bunch more in there, but you're using the just dialogue to reveal, several years of context in the boys' lives and their interactions with various family members, parents, cousins, aunts and uncles, and friends, and each other, of course. Now, I'm a playwright by kind of practice and experience, so I'm used to being limited to only using dialogue to tell a story. And so when I switched to novels a few years ago, it was really a whole new world to be able to use more than just dialogue, narrative, backstory, inner thoughts, history, all that stuff. And so my question to you is, was it hard to stick to just dialogues and not lapse into narrative prose in the execution of this chapter?
That's an interesting question. I don't want to sound fat-headed, but when you asked the question, I thought, was it hard for Picasso just to paint in blue?
Good answer.
It's a challenge for the writer. All of art is a matter of what you leave in and what you take out, as another rock song said. I think it's Against the Wind by Bob Seger. And you always have, I guess, what's in voice called a tessitura, which is kind of the universe of possible sounds. And so to limit yourself, like to just the color blue or shades of blue, is a kind of discipline that an artist takes on, the way, let's say, writing a sonnet is a discipline. That's got to be 14 lines, right? And if it's a real sonnet, it's got to have a certain one of two rhyme schemes. So in a similar way, I approach this chapter as a challenge, but I really wanted to do it. I thought it was a way to handle that material in a fresh way, and also not just to test my ability to tell a story in dialogue, which is not so easy, as you know, Tom, but also to tell a story using the particular language of these characters, because these two characters, the first character is a boy from New York who's 12. The second chapter is told by a man in his early 40s who's really a Brooklyn wise guy kind of guy. And this third chapter is narrated in dialogue by these two people from the South. And I found that to be a challenge, to write in the South, but the new South, not the old South, the Atlanta South, the Georgia South, or the North Carolina South. And I spent a lot of time listening to the different expressions, looking up the different expressions, and hopefully coming up with two characters who are made real by the voices that they speak in.
And to follow up on that, so the interesting that the gear shift change going into chapter 4 now,
right?
Speaking of dialogue, is that in chapter 4, you basically end up stripping away the characters speaking the dialogue, and now you're letting the emotions within a single character speak. It's a dialogue, but it's more like a Greek chorus. They're observing, they're commenting, they're tormenting the protagonist. Only in the Greek chorus is talking about this particular one is talking about the avocado seed in a jar, which is a beautiful metaphor for what the characters were going through. So it's kind of the same question as before. How was it to keep it between the chorus and the protagonist? So I guess maybe the answer is the same, but it's the discipline of having to say, I've only got what the chorus can say now to advance the story, and I can't go into their heads or the boys' heads.
Right. Yeah. That's a good question. So just to give everyone who hasn't read the book yet, just a little detail. In this fourth chapter, it's an ego that splits up. And so the different emotions of the ego speak and take turns speaking and interrupt each other. And so this is someone who's got heavy post-traumatic stress disorder that he's unwilling to deal with. And so the characters, the voices are fear, anger, sadness, guilt, shame, pain. And the challenge for me in this was to make sure that when the voices were changing, the tone changed. So the angry character was always angry, and the sad character was always sad, and the guilty character was always guilty. That's what I really focused on there. And I didn't worry so much about their language, making them differentiating them by the vocabulary they use, and more in just the raw emotion that each of these voices or characters were expressing during this chapter.
Yeah, and to your credit, I ended up not looking at the character name, the chorus member's name. I could tell by what they were saying which one they were. So
well, that makes me feel good to
yeah.
know that
so mission accomplished on that one.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Now, what's really kind of cool, then there's another shift now into chapter 5. So chapter 5 is a letter to Lee in a voice of a girl that had jilted him. And this letter is from some years after the jilt, and the lasting damage to Lee had been foreshadowed in a number in earlier chapters. And the contrast between the fond memories of the girl has of the incident and the wreckage left in Lee, which is both sad. The letter is both sad and hopeful. And I guess my question to you is, what do you think her intentions were in writing him the letter? Was it to absolve herself, or to help Lee kind of leave the wreckage behind, or both?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the character's name Lynette, and I think that she is a kind of hippy-trippy, mystical kind of person who talks about the mystical connection that she'll always have with Leon, whose heart she's broken. And I believe that she is just expressing her feelings in a very new age kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And that she's unable to see the impact on Lee. The letter heals her, so she assumes it's healing Lee.
Yeah, because that kind of came through, that she seemed to be unaware of the wreckage she caused. And that was kind of very revealing about her character. Let's see, in the next one, chapter 6 is a really interesting philosophical and theological discussion between Jules and this kid Noah, who's like 15 or something. And so I have no knowledge of Jewish rituals and culture. Right. So I knew it was some sort of pool that they were going to. I forget the name.
Mikvah. It's called the mikvah.
Mikvah. Yeah. And so it was the only question I have was, was whose voice was this? And I think it was Jules. No, it was Lee's. Lee's.
No,
It was
no,
Jules
no,
in San Francisco.
no. So it was actually third person.
Okay, yeah, that was
The
the
third
difference. 'Cause
person.
Yeah.
What's the third person that can see into
Uh-huh.
the mind of one character?
Yeah, because that's why I
I'm
couldn't. Is
forgetting. Is
Yeah.
that called third person semi-omniscient or something like that?
Yeah, because I couldn't figure
Yeah.
out which one was this for.
Right. So
And
that point of view is like a godlike figure.
Yeah.
Who looks down and sees this.
Uh-huh.
And this particular chapter takes place in a mikveh, which is a Jewish ritual bath.
Uh-huh. And so I don't want it to be a story ruiner thing. Why didn't he jump in the water?
No, that one I can't share.
Okay.
That everyone's got to come to their own conclusion.
Okay.
But I will say that there's a lot of strong water imagery throughout the novel, and throughout the novel, you'll see Jules and somebody else at the water
Mm-hmm.
in a healing situation.
Okay.
And here, Jules is alone facing this body of water,
Mm-hmm.
the mikveh, which is a stand-in for the infinite,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, because it's it's a symbol of cleansing yourself
Mm-hmm.
ritually to prepare for God or whatever is out there.
Whatever's next, yeah.
Right, and so he doesn't jump.
Okay.
And why he doesn't jump, I'll leave that to everyone to write about in their doctoral dissertation.
Yeah. Yeah. So the one then there's a kind of another big gear shift change in that for chapter 7, 8, and 9, 7 is the mom's voice, and essentially it's a core dump. It's short and harrowing, and a harrowing chapter. 8 is in Lee's voice again. It's short and harrowing again, but it reveals what drives kind of his self-destructive behavior. And then 10 is poetic and short about Lee falling and Jules's voice again. So 9, 10, and 11 are all poetic and short. And so I'm not from a poetry background. So I was like, so why, what were these? What voices that?
So this flash fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's in the, Leon is a first person narration.
Mm-hmm.
And the chapter narrated by the mother, Ethel, is short first person narration that sounds like a prose poem. And then the 3 chapters that come after that, they're all at the point where prose poetry meets flash fiction.
Okay.
And again, I wanted to keep changing the style. I guess it's my fault. I get bored so quickly that I have to keep changing styles or I'll lose interest in what I'm writing.
Okay, so then
somebody laugh at that, please. I'm just.
That was me. It was me. So
Thank you.
so we go from 3 short, like 1 page, sometimes half a page chapters to
Right.
the mother of all chapters. It's chapter 12 is long. But what a chapter. It's this extraordinary road trip through time, both kind of literally and figuratively, where he's visiting an assortment of characters. This is Jules now, who's encountered in various ways, 25 years before when he was basically a different person. And he weaves them all together, the living and the dead, and along with Shiva and Buddha and Schrodinger's cat. I mean, it's a wild chapter. But the pivot point to me in reading it was dealing with what is perhaps the most formative relationship in his life, perhaps more than with his mother and father, specifically this 4-year relationship he has with this woman named Elle, since that's what got him to kind of abandon his old world and create this whole new one with a wife and a daughter and a career. So here's the question. What do you think changed him more, the wife of 25 years or the girlfriend of 4 years from 25 years before that?
Oh, that's another one for literary critics to talk about. But, uh, you know, when you live with someone for 25 years, I think that has a big effect on you more than 40 years. But it's hard for me to answer that question without going outside the world of the novel.
Okay. Okay.
Uh, but it's pretty clear that uh, his wife May and his daughter Maya have tremendous influence on him and have made him a better person.
Hmm.
Because at the point that he leaves Elle, he's pretty much a mess.
Yeah, he's pretty bottomed out. I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
that's
yeah.
maybe that was the point of her. She was there to bottom him out so he could basically.
Right. Yeah, and in fact, that's what happens.
Yeah.
So, do I have time to talk a little bit about the length of the chapters?
Oh, take it away. Take it away. It's
Okay.
that was the last question, and then it's after you. It's back to Gene and Q&A after that.
Okay, so let me just say this one quick thing uh, about the length of the chapters. The chapters get shorter and shorter and shorter, and then you've got this really long last chapter. And so if you were to chart that as a bar graph, it looks like you're rolling down a hill and then climbing up a steep one. But let's reverse that bar graph for all you math majors. So instead of it being in a positive quadrant and a negative quadrant, in other words, so that the bars go down, then what you have is an image of a cliff, because it gets narrower and narrower, like a cliff you might see in a Roadrunner movie,
Uh-huh.
and then jumping into a big abyss. That's the last chapter. So I thought about both those things in formulating the novel so that you would have both the mountain and the cliff kind
Yeah.
of concrete, concrete image of the whole book. And that's probably a pretty poetry thing to do, to think in terms of the whole novel, in terms of what it looks like, not even on the page here, but in the mind's eye.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so sorry to bore everyone with that last little bit.
No, I've spent all my ammo. So now, Gene, over to you.
Thank you both, actually, for that wonderful discussion. That's really a fascinating book and an interesting discussion. I should also mention to everybody, if you haven't seen today's New York Times, there was a beautiful ad for the book in the New York Times Book Review today. So if you happen to have one laying around, take a look at it. It looks really sharp. But what we'd like to do now is turn it over to you. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share with Mark, if you could either unmute if you'd like to do that, or put them in the chat. I'll keep my eye on that. But I'll turn it over to the audience.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
I'm just curious, how long of a project was this for you to develop this novel?
That's a really good question, Gene. Joe, I'm sorry.
Oh,
It's
either
a
one,
good
I got
question,
both.
Joe. Yeah. It said Gene up there, but I know you as Joe. So I wrote the first draft of the second chapter in the mid-70s. And I also wrote the beginning of the last chapter in the mid-70s. The chapter called Hashmal, which is about the mikveh, I wrote that as a standalone short story in the mid-80s. And then in about the year 2005, I wrote the first chapter as a standalone poem. And then I just started putting these pieces together and coming up with new chapters and shaping this material, because some of the early versions, like the first version of the second chapter, was pretty bad writing. It took me a long time to become a good writer, I think. Um, uh, so basically, I've been working on it for 30 or more years, but most of it I did during a 3-year period, 2015 on, when I started getting very serious about turning these things into a novel and, finishing it. Good question, Joe.
I have a question. My name is Anisha Perone. Mark, I'm just enjoying, I haven't read it, but it certainly makes me want to read it.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so intrigued by your process as you talk about it, and how it was over a long period of time, and how some chapters even stood out alone. And then they became incorporated within a novel. And it sounds like you've done that very successfully. My question for you, I like that whole kind of organic process. And my question would be, were there any surprises for you personally? Did you see a development within you at the end of your process?
Okay. So the easiest way to answer that is to admit that one reason that it took me so long to write this novel was because I had a specific writer's block about it, and about writing a novel. And by the end of the novel, I didn't have that writer's block anymore. And my second novel is coming along really quickly. And when I get to, barriers, I figure out how to solve them.
Wow.
I don't shut down. And so that's what I learned in writing The Brothers Silver, was that I knew how to write a novel.
Nice, very nice. Thank you very much.
More questions? So this must mean I bored everybody.
Well, you kept me actively engaged, and I asked a lot of questions. So
Right, that's true, Tom. You did your job.
Well, if there
That
aren't
was
any
really
other,
interesting, Mark. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
This is
Thank
Sue
you.
Diamond in California.
Thank you, Sue. And Irv.
I thought it was really interesting how you wrote the novel and incorporated your poetry in the book. I didn't know it was going to be like
So, okay, so yeah, actually, some of the paragraphs started as poems that I published, and then I either reused the material or more often changed it a little bit. And I was thinking about that the other day, and what I was thinking about that when I was at this exhibit of Cézanne's drawings. And so what I want to say is that, to me, each of these poems was like a study that a painter makes for a big painting. And so if you go to Madrid and see Guernica, in the room which is the great Picasso painting, in the same room, you can see literally 50 studies that he did for it, little details that he was working on, that or other details that he was experimenting with. And so I really think that I've used a similar process here, in that all these little snippets that were published were studies for the larger piece, for the larger novel.
Mark,
Does that make sense?
You there?
Yes.
Here's my
What?
question. I read an earlier version of the novel, and I was
It's pretty
impressed.
bad,
by,
I remember.
I was impressed by the protagonist's travels in the 60s, often hitchhiking, often picking up hitchhikers. Then later in his life, he goes back to the West, and he finds these people that he knew in the 60s, and he comments on them very interestingly. Now, it seems to me that you've taken that narrative and you've moved it all into chapter 12, which
Yes.
sounds okay to me, but I'm sort of interested in your take on that.
Okay, so, you know, as I progressed through the novel, I kept thinking of new ways to tell the story. And every writer faces this. You can't have every chapter start in the same way, for example. And so the last part of the story, as far as the family goes, is this period which it happens to be the 70s, but that's okay. It sounds like the 60s, doesn't it? And there wasn't much difference, or at least I don't remember much difference. But in any case, and so to go back in time to remember what was happening for this part of the chronology was a different way to present the material. And I was also trying to give it some resonance for today. What happens to these characters years afterwards? And so I came up with this idea to do kind of a Rip Van Winkle kind of thing.
The thing that I found very interesting about that was not so much what happened to those characters, but what happened to the protagonist in his view of himself and of these people that he knew from his past and knows them again in his present. Very, very interesting stuff.
Well, thanks. Yeah. And I did want to work on that because, you know, it's in contrast that you can see truths, I think. Something, you know, and in contrast, things also look different. I probably just contradicted myself there.
We're coming up on time here, so I'd like to thank Mark Jampol, author of The Brothers Silver, and Tom Strelich, author of Dog Logic. Both books are available at owlcanyonpress.com and wherever fine books are sold. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and please buy a lot of copies.